Welcome to the Jersey Justice Podcast, featuring your hosts, attorneys Gerald Clark and Mark Morris.
So Jack Ford, thanks for coming on. It's funny when I think about you, and we run into each other from time to time over the years. A couple things that I think about is back in the day when I was in high school, some of my friends got caught with a keg of beer in high school, and thankfully I wasn't with them that night. But
that night,
exactly. It was fortuitous, and you ended up representing him in municipal court. And I remember my good friend, he was like, "Yeah, Jack Ford came, and he was in a suit, and it was so impressive, and how he stood up there." And that's one of the things I thought about that back in high school, and I said to myself, that'd be kind of cool, and that's one of the things I think about, like when I go way back as to why I became a lawyer.
It's funny you talk about the municipal courts, and most of my practice, and similar to you, you're very successful as a trial lawyer, and I was in the trial courts and state courts and federal courts, but my forays into municipal courts were almost always for the children of friends of mine.
Yes.
Who said, he was not a bad kid, got caught with a keg of beer, was out, past the curfew.
Yeah.
Can you help him out?
Yeah.
And you'd wonder, and it'd be nice kids like you and your friends back then, and they'd be taught a little bit of a lesson, and it wasn't painful, and it was fine. But those were usual. When I was wandering into municipal courts, it was usually to try and help out the kids of my friends.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember I took a trial class at Fordham University, and I forget the guy's name that taught it, but he was an adjunct, and he was a famous. I don't know that he was famous, but he represented a lot of mobsters, and he would joke like I said to him. I was a young law student. I asked him. I said, like, how do you represent guys like that do that? Like, how do you, and I'm sure you've gotten the question over the years, like, can you represent someone if you know they're guilty? And we all know the answer to that question is, everyone has the constitutional rights, and there has to be due process. And if they admit to you that they're guilty, you can still represent them. You just can't put them on the stand and ask them whether or not they did it, because you can't, I guess,
engage in perjury.
Yeah, but he would say how he would go to these cocktail parties with these conservative people and their friends, and they would joke, who are you getting off today? And they would like kind of make fun of him until and he answered this question that I was asking about, how can you do this? And then the same guy that used to joke to him, his kid got caught with a bag of cocaine in the car or something like that, and the guy said, can they just pull you over and do that? It's kind of funny.
It's once it becomes personal, then your perspective is very different on it. Then you tend to embrace this idea that, look, everybody's entitled to representation, and hopefully good representation.
Yeah.
And what people don't understand, you do as an experienced trial lawyer, what people don't understand is if you're doing criminal defense work, and a good portion of my practice back then was that, your purpose is not always to get the guy off.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, and experienced defense attorneys will tell you, the vast majority of people charged with crimes are guilty of something.
Yeah.
Right? The troubling ones are, and I had this a few times, when you have somebody who's truly innocent.
Yeah.
And you're the only thing standing between them and perhaps a lengthy jail term, that's the stuff that used to keep me up.
Yeah.
When you're representing the ones who did either that or something, the idea is, all right, if there's enough evidence to convict them, and that's the system works. You got to make sure there's enough evidence, and it's done right.
Yeah.
If there's not enough, people would say to me, guy was found not guilty, the system didn't work.
Yeah.
And the answer is no. If somebody's found not guilty, it's because the system did work, because 12 jurors said, hey, there's just not enough evidence.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, most people don't realize, and I hear this in the media all the time, and it drives me crazy when I hear journalists say, well, they found him innocent today. And the answer is, no.
Yeah.
There is no innocent in the justice system. There's guilty. We know what that means. There's not guilty.
Yeah.
And not guilty can mean a whole lot of things. It can mean in the juror's mind, my gut, I think you did this.
Yeah.
But you know what? Prosecution didn't have enough evidence, and I'm told, I have a sworn duty here to say not guilty if that's the case. So, it's an interesting dance that you do. I taught in law school. As you went to Fordham Law School, I taught trial advocacy in Fordham Law School when I was still practicing, and we would have those questions routinely.
Yeah.
And then you always have them from the public.
Yeah.
And you hope that people will understand. And I tell you what, Jerry, there were a couple of times that I got not guilty verdicts from people, and I knew that they had done it, but I couldn't do what you mentioned. I couldn't put them on the stand to say, no, I didn't do it, because then you're part of perjury.
Yeah.
But you provided a defense, or maybe you challenged all the evidence that the prosecution had in it wasn't enough.
Yeah.
And at the end, I didn't feel great about myself.
Oh, really?
Because of who they were. But what you say to yourself is, for the system to work the way it was designed to do. When a lot of people talk about our justice system and all the flaws that it has, and the answer I heard somebody say, well, yeah, it's terribly flawed, but it's still better than any other justice system out there.
Yeah.
And what you have to say is, okay, here's a guy who's going to walk away.
Yeah.
Oftentimes the guiding principle is, in our justice system, better that 100 guilty people walk away than one innocent person be convicted.
Yeah.
That's why we have all those protections built into this system. But it doesn't always mean, I have some friends that if they did, they'd celebrate, they'd have a party. Yeah. Sometimes I looked at myself in the mirror when I got home. I said, I'm not really happy with myself right now.
That would be after a jury verdict.
After a jury verdict where you got a not guilty.
Did you find, though, like when you were trying, did you just try criminal cases, or did you ever try civil stuff?
No, I did a lot of. I tried everything from antitrust cases to death penalty cases.
Right.
So basically that's what I was. I was a trial lawyer, and I even had some relationships with some big firms around the country where if there's something going on in New Jersey around here, they'd bring me in to try it for them. But as I said, it ranged from, I did some malpractice defense work, did some malpractice plaintiffs work. I did, a couple of antitrust cases, did a lot of white-collar criminal
malpractice
cases.
Medical, or?
Yeah. We had, there were a couple of doctors that I knew, and back then, usually there are insurance companies that are involved in it, but every once in a while, back then, probably not the same now, the doctors could ask for somebody, and you'd meet with the insurance company, and they'd be comfortable with that fact.
Right.
So really, I kind of tried a range of everything. I was always of the belief that you didn't have to be either a civil attorney or a criminal attorney.
Yeah.
The skills are the same.
Yeah.
If you can try a case, you can try a case.
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're just changing the content of those cases.
Yeah. So just a couple things is when you when you took the not guilty verdict for someone that you think actually did it, or you knew did it, whatever, and you didn't feel great about that, did you find that when you tried a case, you had to believe in the case? Like if I've only tried, I tried mostly like injury cases, things like that. And when we have these injury cases, the insurance company, they start from it's like lawyers. Like I find lawyers were trained to like think of the worst case scenario and then work backwards from there, which is why when tough things happen to a lawyer themselves, like in their life or something, or they're going through a stressful period, sometimes it can be harder for lawyers because they think of the worst case that can happen in this situation.
That's your mindset. That's your mindset. That's how you've been trained.
Yeah, and then work back from there. But I find when I'm trying cases, like if I don't believe the case, it's harder to sell it to a jury and present it to a jury. Did you find that as a criminal lawyer?
And I also did a lot of plaintiffs' civil work.
Okay.
Right? And I think I would think it was a little bit more difficult for me in a civil case if you didn't truly believe in everything.
Yeah.
To sell that.
Yeah.
In a criminal case, again, you don't need to believe in the innocence. Again, I'm using innocence of your client, even though innocence doesn't enter into the picture. Right. It comes verdicts. But I think you needed to, because jurors are very perceptive.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've experienced that. Jurors really understand what's going on. I used to say when I taught in law school, I said, look, here's what you want. You want the jurors to, at the very least, respect you.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't mean they're going to agree with you.
Yeah.
But if they at least respect you and the job you're doing, if you're lucky, they might like you. And that can be helped. Look, this is human dynamics.
Yeah.
You're standing in front of 12 people or 6 people or whatever it is, and you're trying to convince them something. It's the same thing if somebody's trying to sell them a car.
Yeah.
If the car salesman is more believable, and I don't want to equate us as trial lawyers, my previous profession, to car salesmen.
Yeah.
With apologies to my friends who are car salesmen.
Yeah.
Jurors want to feel that they have a level of confidence in what they're being sold.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I often said when I teach, it has to do with how you dress. I wouldn't be too flashy in a courtroom. I wouldn't wear pocket squares.
Yeah.
Depending upon my jury composition, I played football in college. I've got a couple of Ivy League championship rings when I played at Yale.
Yeah.
I might wear one.
Yeah.
And kind of have my hand there and have people sort of look and get some nods. So it's a very complicated kind of interpersonal relationship dance that you're doing with jurors. And a lot of them can sense if you don't really believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
And as a criminal defense attorney, you don't have to believe in the innocence of your client, but you have to believe in the process.
Yeah.
Believe in the justice system.
Yeah.
And they'll get that.
Yeah. Yeah, so these insurance companies, that what I find is they start with, okay, this is a fraud. It didn't even happen in an accident case, and then they move forward from there. And they're always challenging whether or not the person's faking their injury, no matter what. Like, people will come to us and, they'll have a bad head injury or whatever, and it'll be clear, who's at fault for what happened. And I tell them, they're like, when do I get my money? I'm like, that's a long way away, because they're going to say you're faking it. Like, they do it in pretty much.
Especially if you can't see it.
Right.
Which, can be the most debilitating
Yeah.
injury. You break a bone, it's going to heal.
Yeah.
If you have a serious head injury, I had some concussions when I was playing in college, and fortunately, they cleared up pretty quickly. But, that's a serious injury, but it's not apparent.
Yeah.
You don't see it on somebody's face the way you see a broken bone and limping and braces on them.
So, like, you live and learn. I remember one of the first cases I tried. It's probably like the 5th jury verdict I had, and I had this case. And we work so hard in these cases, and it's just natural to sort of like start to believe the client and really. And I had this case for so long, and I tried it. We were in our 4th day of trial. The defense starts their case, and they press play on a videotape that I never saw, which is my client working, pulling cleaning supplies out of a car, going to a job. And she's been telling me she can't work, and I was mad at her.
Yeah.
And like in that situation. And I've learned since then I really challenge the clients in the beginning. I make sure, because I never want a situation where I've gotten a jury verdict, gotten a good recovery and feel bad about it.
Yeah.
But I guess it's just different in the criminal world. And I think it's important, like what you were saying, because I guess it all started when we were, colonists, and the British would come into the house and say, I'm staying here, I'm taking your stuff. Or they would just summarily find someone guilty, summarily take them out back, and so I guess it's important to like, you can probably say it better than I can, but like, you have to put the state to the test. You have to challenge and make sure the constitutional rights are being protected.
Yeah. I teach an undergraduate seminar up at Yale on famous trials.
Yeah.
It's an offshoot of a series I did when I was with NBC News and covering the O.J. Simpson trial.
Yeah.
And if you remember, everybody's watching the Simpson trial. 150 million people live watched the verdict. And bigger than any Super Bowl.
All right. So we have the Parker House in Seagirt, New Jersey.
Yep.
Some people might know about it.
Yep.
And I think it was when did I graduate undergrad? 94. I think it was the summer of 94.
That was the murder.
And you were telling, because I watched some of your videos before today, and you were saying how there was a basketball game on. I was at the Parker House, and I'm pretty sure it was the hockey finals.
It may well have been. It's that time of the year, June. It was June 12th was the murder, and I think June 17th was the
chase,
the Bronco chase.
So I'm watching the Bronco chase, and everyone's at the Parker House, and this big TV in the corner. We were dumb kids, and we were like, oh, he's running away, and he's at the 30, he's at the 20, he's at the 10.
Yep.
And it's, you joke about it, but it's a terrible, sad thing that happened, like with the murders.
It was an awful case. Ron Goldman, who was just a neighborhood waiter and was returning stuff. Yeah.
Before you go there, I started out.
We can come back.
No, I want to come back to it. That's a huge thing. But so that's one thing when I think of Jack Ford is part of the reason I went to law school is my friend telling me that story. And I was just in high school, and I said, that'd be a cool thing to do. The second thing I think about when I think of Jack Ford going back is, as lawyers, we work so hard, we slog in the courtroom, and it's like, I remember in the 90s and the 2000s, lawyer friends, they'd be like, how the heck does this guy get out of slogging in the courtroom and now he's jet setting around the world from here to there? So that's one thing we got to get to is like that transition between slogging it in the courtroom.
Yeah.
You know, it's not. You know, you see the you see the NBA finals and all. You see the guy doing great in basketball, but you don't know the work that goes to get there. So we got to get to that anyway. But go ahead. Tell about the OJ
just
thing.
to tie
the
into
OJ
what you're
thing.
talking about. So people are talking about OJ as the trial of the century.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is an important trial, but there were a lot of other important trials in this last century. So
Yeah.
did a series for the Today Show, and we called it Trials of the Century. And we picked about 5 or 6 different trials. And I thought at the time, this could be an interesting course. I loved my time teaching at Fordham Law School when I was practicing law. Now I'm in television journalism world. And I didn't have enough control of my calendar to be able to commit to a course. And as years went by, I was able to. And I started doing this. I just finished my 18th year teaching up at Yale. But this is a long way to come back to your point, which is, we have 12 trials over a span of 100 years in different categories: race in the courtroom, religion, politics in the courtroom, war in the courtroom. But one of the underlying themes is what you just mentioned, which is, look, our justice system is essentially a reaction to what we were subjected to when we were a colony. This idea, our Constitution now, it prohibits the government from housing soldiers in our homes because we didn't like it when the British did that. Our whole concept of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the obligation proof on the prosecution, all these are consequences of what we didn't like about being a colony. Well, and that's sort of the foundation of our justice system is all of that.
And I think even going back farther than that, in the New World, was the Salem witch trials, which was, I guess that was maybe 100 or 150 years before 1776. And these Salem witch trials, it was just the most barbaric, terrible things. They would like dip people in water and they would confess, or there was a thing where they would lie them down and put a rock on them. And there was
the standard of proof, now we know what it is. The criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's by a preponderance of the evidence. In the civil case, in the witch trials, there were stories about they would throw somebody in the water, and if they floated, they were away, one or the other. Either they floated or they sunk, and one of them was really bad for you. And that's what the approach to a justice system was, which is what created our foundation, saying, look, even if we all know you're guilty, you still have to be able to prove it inside a courtroom.
Yeah, that was. I guess it was very religious based. The Salem witch trials and the Puritans in Connecticut. But it was also a mass hysteria thing too. There was like if the crops went bad, it was because this woman who's a witch put a spell on them.
Right, and a lot of it had to do with the concept of otherness.
Yeah,
somebody looked different.
Yeah,
they acted different. They sounded, and we still see this in our justice system. How do you dress a client for court? How do you, as a lawyer, dress for court? This notion of society kind of rejects otherness.
Yeah.
And that can be very dangerous in situations such as the Salem witch trial, but it can be dangerous inside of a courtroom.
Yeah.
If there's something about your client, if your client doesn't speak English, there's something about your client that they look different. That gets them in the minds of jurors into a category of otherness. That can be dangerous to the system. That's why the system has all of these protections built into it. And judges who have to preside over all this to make sure that the protections are indeed taken care of.
Yeah, it's important. I think, like I found, for the jurors to somewhat identify with your client and put themselves in their shoes, and it is a challenge. Because we represent a lot of non-English speaking, immigrant workers that get hurt. And what we try to do a lot of times is, because we'll do before and after pictures. And a lot of times we'll try to find a picture of them in front of the castle at Disney World, something like that, where they can identify with it.
Yeah, exactly. And people can see it and say, "No, I did that." And now another picture where they're in a wheelchair or whatever it might be, and that creates the images that you need.
Do you think, because you're writing novels and you seem like a super thinker, and I'm sure you must have been to go to Yale and all that, and do you think that this, if you talk about the Salem witch trials, do you think some of it is like a power thing where religion is used as a power? Like if you see what I was reading, just so I want to talk to you about social media, how everything is changing from when you were regularly on the air at NBC and the differences today. But I was reading. I read the Wall Street Journal a lot now, the actual newspaper.
Right.
And I was a few weeks behind, and they were talking about, they were covering the bombing in Iran, where Israel went in, and then the president went in, and the nuclear facilities, and then after that, in Iran itself, there's a huge crackdown on the morality police are coming in and enforcing these religious mores and all this stuff, and it's pretty obvious that the regime in Iran is just concerned that they might lose power, so now they bring the police out to enforce all those dumb whatever rules about this and that. Do you find, like, and you've traveled the world and you've been involved with so many high profile things, that religion can be used to keep for power over people?
Sure. You can look at religion and easily conclude that religion is the great both uniting and dividing power throughout the history of humankind. We tend to like to surround ourselves with similar people. Religion allows you to do that. The concept, it's interesting you mentioned, I was having a conversation with my 9-year-old grandson this weekend, and he'd been going to his CDC school, in the summer to prepare. He doesn't go to a Catholic school, but they want him, he did communion, they want him to do confirmation. And we were talking about this whole concept of religion and what it means. And he's a very smart kid. So we came to the conclusion that at the core of any religion is the concept of being a good person.
Exactly.
But then he said to me, well, why don't they get along? Which is a really perceptive question by a 9-year-old. If you're all looking to do the same thing, be a good person, how can there be these conflicts? And, as you know, throughout history, more deaths have been caused by religious wars than anything else.
Wow.
And it's hard to imagine that.
Yeah.
Again, it's supposed to be this great uniting force, but also becomes this great dividing force.
Yeah.
So we saw it in the Middle Ages with the Crusades. We continue to see it today, where governments will embrace one religion and not just distance itself from the other, but persecute another religion. Yeah. So I think the sad answer is yes, that's something which should at the core be a good person, which means embrace other people, is the mechanism that triggers so much rejection and so much anger and so much hatred and so much violence.
Yeah. I think like hardcore religion and lack of education is a toxic combination as well.
Was it Marx or Lenin? I should remember this about religion being the opiate of the masses.
Yeah.
I should remember which one of them said that. But it's now look, religion serves a wonderful purpose and has throughout mankind. I have great respect for people who have deep religious beliefs.
Yeah.
I'm fairly spiritual.
Yeah.
I'm not as much organizational religious kind of thing.
I was I visited Belfast in Ireland a few summers ago, and the Black Cabs guy took us around a tour, and I guess it's Shankville Avenue or whatever, which separates the Catholic and the Protestant section. Yeah. And it just made no sense to me. Like they're still at odds. It's not like it was in the 90s and before.
It's starting to percolate a little bit more. Sadly, but not like the time of the Troubles when everybody was blowing everybody else up.
Yeah, and I said, I was like, what? I can't get. I mean, the religions are so close.
That's the point.
It's Christianity.
Yeah. You look at Catholicism and Protestantism.
Yeah.
How significant are the differences between the two? Well, they're really not when you get to the core of them.
Yeah.
And yet, why could that be the basis for these generational battles?
Yeah.
And bombings and deaths.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more to it, obviously, than that. There's the political component, but it seems to come down to that. And you look at it and you say, if you looked at the elements of those and tried to compare them, you have more similarities than you have differences.
Yeah, I couldn't understand it.
Right. It's hard to understand unless you grew up.
Exactly, and that's what he said. He goes, it just goes back generations. Right. They've learned to hate the other side, and it's terrible. And
the great song from South Pacific talking about how you have to be taught how to hate.
Yeah.
And if you from the time you're a child, you're told to hate the people who live 3 blocks down because they go to a different church than you do.
Yeah.
Then that's unfortunately what's going to stay in your mind.
Yeah. And you've written isn't one of the, I think you've written about 4 novels or whatever. Wasn't one of them about the Old South or something, or about the segregation?
I did my second book that I did called The Walls of Jericho. And they're all historical fiction.
Right.
So based on, some sort of a small part of a true story that comes from it. My most recent one, called Beyond This Place of Wrath and Tears, is essentially, based on the true story of a woman who was this courageous combat correspondent
Journalist.
in World War II in the European theater. There were only a handful of them. There were none in the Pacific theater because General MacArthur would not allow women. Right. But this Lee Carson, I stumbled across her story. She died young, so her story had not been continued. She didn't have any family. But it's what I like to find, a story to tell about. And hers it's just fascinating. I pitched to my publisher saying, imagine the Forrest Gump of reporting in World War II. That's her. She was everywhere. But the one you're mentioning, Walls of Jericho. So I have spent a lot of time teaching down at the University of Mississippi, both law school and their journalism school. And I've got a good friend. Football fans will recognize the Manning family. Right? So Archie Manning played at Ole Miss. Eli played at Ole Miss. Archie and I have been good friends for 40 years. We're both. He's the chairman of the National Football Foundation, College Football Hall of Fame. I'm vice chairman of it. So we've been close. So I always go down and stay with him and go to the games. And I was fascinated by the history, of Ole Miss, especially during the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
James Meredith in 1962, national attention because Supreme Court said, yes, you have to allow him. And yet there were days of riots on the campus, mostly by outsiders.
Right.
Not so much by the students. Some were involved. And then I would go down now and see what it's become. There's a quote on one of the walls recognizing James Meredith as this pioneer.
Yeah. And
it's by a woman who is also a civil rights pioneer down there. And she wrote about, yes, Mississippi was, but now Mississippi is.
Right.
And we're proud of what we've become. Are there problems? Still.
Yeah.
But I was fascinated by the whole thing. And I came across a story about an unsolved civil rights murder.
Right.
It was a pastor, a reverend who was driving home from giving a speech with late 50s, giving a speech about trying to get black people to register to vote.
Right.
Because that's where the jury would come from. People might remember the Emmett Till trial, where Emmett Till was brutally murdered, and the men who did it, there was all sorts of evidence against them, but the jury of 12 white men let them go. They turned around later and for $4,000 confessed to this brutal killing to Time magazine. But the point of, there was not a single registered black voter in Mississippi at the time, in the late 50s.
Wow.
So, and that's where your jurors would come from.
In this
county,
state?
in this
the county.
In this
yeah.
county.
Got it.
And it was a very rural county.
Yeah.
But so I found this story, and this minister had been in his car. Obviously, somebody forced him over, shotgunned him to death.
Yeah.
And the local sheriff decided it was an accident.
Yeah.
And all those pellets in his head were probably fillings that came out of his mouth when he drove his car off the road. And that was it. Never investigated, nothing. And I looked at that and I said, I wonder how that case would play today in the Mississippi that I got to know, and that this one, a black woman who was a zealous advocate for civil rights said now it's a different Mississippi. So that was the basis for it, and I had it. This kind of 1960s civil rights murder starts to unravel in the present.
Right.
And the one character was a law professor at Ole Miss, and he ends up connecting, and his father was an icon.
Right.
The Supreme Court of the state of Mississippi, a civil rights leader. He partners up with a woman who's a reporter from the Times. Her father had been a KKK organizer.
Oh, wow.
So it brings these different people together, and then they start pursuing this, and it opens up all sorts of old and dangerous stories. So it's I find it interesting to reach back in history, find something that's true,
right,
tell that story, but to compel it and move it along and create conversations, you have to make it fiction.
Right.
but you still stay with the core
Right.
of it, the true core.
So
of
what's
story.
the setting? Is the setting the same time? Is it still the 50s or is
So I moved it into the 60s a little
Okay.
bit. So I'm sorry. So I moved the killing into the early 60s.
Right.
And I moved it when I wrote it was probably, I'm trying to think, 16, 18 years ago. I made
Right.
it kind of around that time.
Right.
Because there were still people, I needed to have people still be alive who
Right.
had been in that experience and stuff. So you could come back to suspects and people who didn't want to solve this case,
Right.
and people who did.
So it's called historical fiction.
Historical
So
fiction.
you take something that actually happened and then
Right.
you kind of mesh it and put okay, wow.
So
that's-
for the current one, for Beyond This Place of Wrath and Tears, I found this great compelling story about this woman.
Yeah.
And she was, it's interesting, she was described by her contemporaries as extraordinarily smart. She started Smith College when she was 14 years old. Dropped out after 2 years. She wanted to be a journalist. She was fearless. She lived through. She had gotten blown out of jeeps where she fractured her arm and other injuries by bombardments. At the Battle of the Bulge, which was famous in the end of 1944, after D-Day, and we're now marching towards Berlin.
Yeah.
And famous Battle of the Bulge. She spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in foxholes being bombarded here. She was the only journalist to fly over the beaches of D-Day.
Yeah.
And part of that was because her fearlessness, her intelligence. She was also, by all accounts, drop-dead gorgeous.
Right,
And
right.
charming. And she used that charm.
Yeah, honey trap, they call that.
She used that charm. She talked her way onto a bomber when nobody else was doing that.
Yeah.
First one to enter liberated Paris the day before it was liberated. And all the time she's fighting these barriers that they imposed upon women just because they were women.
Right.
So they were told, for instance, when she first got there, she covered the buildup in London. And then, after a couple of days, they let journalists cross over into Normandy and start following with the troops. And the women reporters, this handful, were told, you can't go any closer to the front lines than where the hospitals are.
Yeah.
Because that's where the women are. And their response was, well, that's where their job is.
Yeah.
Our job is to report on the war. How are you going to make us report on the war when you're not letting us be there? She broke the rules constantly. She kept getting arrested for breaking these kind of artificial barriers. The men could go report, but they wouldn't let the women go report. So, a lot of it is her story, is this fearless reporter saying, I'm going to go where the story is, because how else can I let people know what's happening over here? And just interesting twists and turns.
And then
the
you
story.
moved her in a fictionally more to the 70s or 80s.
Yeah, did what they call a dual
undercovering a spy.
timeline thing,
Okay,
Jerry. And
got it.
it's an interesting. You see a lot of it. Books go through cycles.
Yeah.
Pretty much the way fashion goes through cycles. And you're seeing a lot of these dual timeline stories now.
Right.
Starts in the present, drops back to the past.
Yeah.
Or starts in the past, gets up to the present. And when we're putting this together, my idea was the core, World War II, that era. And when she came back afterwards, what happened to her is what happened to so many women who had stepped up to take the jobs for World War II, but the men came back.
Yeah.
And, you can understand it to some extent, but basically the men then took the jobs. And a lot of these women just got shuttled off.
Yeah.
When she came back after this, being in the midst of all the combat and breaking big stories, she became pretty famous back home.
Yeah.
She would show up in Walter Winchell's columns. Walter Winchell was the first sort of, gossip columnist, if you will. You got in his column, you became famous. So she became famous. Interestingly referred to by him as a gal reporter.
She came in real life. She became famous, or in the book?
No,
Got
in
it.
real life, she became famous back then. I found an article in Time magazine about her and a couple of the female reporters while this is all going on. So there was a bit of with all of the horror of combat, there was a bit of romance about these women. Who were covering all this. So, but she comes back home. And she's relegated to writing. I shouldn't say relegated, because those are important stories. But it's not what she wanted to do.
Right.
Instead of doing the big combat stories, she's now doing stories about fashion and profiles in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And my editor, when was looking at this, my editor was wonderful. She comes up with an idea. She says, what if we sort of weave into it what she might have done
Yeah.
when she came back?
Yeah.
that given her history of this courageous, fearless reporter.
Yeah.
So I said, let me think about that a little bit. And what we've done is we've sort of bookended the story. So the main part of it is the World War II. It starts in the beginning, again, imagining.
Yeah.
And she's back in D.C., and it's in the 50s now, at the height of the Red Scare, right? And all of a sudden, she stumbles into a Russian spy ring in D.C. Now, based, by the way, on real facts, if you will.
Right.
True stories. I populated with some people who actually were there. I've changed a couple of names, but some of the people are there. And so she starts out chasing down this spy story, and then transitions kind of, she's a relationship with somebody, and in conversation, all of a sudden, it takes her back into World War II. So it takes her all the way through to VE Day.
Yeah.
And interestingly, one of the reasons my publisher wanted to get this out now, because it's the 80th, this year is the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day.
Yeah.
And she was there. So we did that. And then it finishes up in this, the imagined 50s and the Russian spy ring that she gets caught in the middle of.
That reminds me, that sounds like, I always wondered if you had Mike Tyson fight Muhammad Ali in their prime. You know what I mean? What would happen? So in a way, you're kind of doing that. You're meshing those things.
That what if is a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
To drive stories.
How are books doing these days? I mean, and this one thing I want to talk to you about, because you were in the media. You started out one of the first correspondents of Court TV, and I remember Saturday Night Live used to joke about Court TV.
They did.
It's not going to be around.
So we started Court TV in 1991.
Yeah.
And I had just quick background. So as you mentioned, I got out of law school, Fordham Law School, same place you went to.
Yeah.
Came back here to Monmouth County, took a job as an assistant prosecutor in Monmouth County because I knew I wanted to try cases.
That would give
me the best opportunity to try cases.
I used to think I was like, well, I've had a pretty good thing, but then when I looked at your bio and stuff, I'm God, I'm such an underachiever.
But Jerry, a lot of it was just right place at the right time.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm working as a prosecutor.
Yeah.
And after about 4 or 5 years, I go into private practice. First at a big firm, and then
so wait, you're at a prosecutor. So
right.
let's go back even farther.
Okay.
You grew up
born in Jersey City.
Right.
And what happened, sort of the moving force in my life is my father disappeared on us when I was about 5 years old. So I was raised by a single mother.
How many were in your family? How many
so
siblings?
I've got an older sister, me, younger sister, younger brother.
Okay.
So my mom was all of a sudden she's literally on a street corner because they came and took the house. She didn't even know it had been foreclosed upon.
Did you remember him at all?
A little bit. Interestingly, when I started getting my name in the papers for sports in high school, he started showing up a little bit, which is kind of awkward. But so my mom.
Wait, so Ford, was that was his name?
Yes. Yeah.
And is that is that Irish or what's your?
A lot of Irish. Yeah. We're I think County Cork.
Yeah.
Okay.
There.
My wife is a Kelly. She's from Waterford. We've gone to Ireland and sort of tracked this all that.
Yeah.
So anyway, my mom was a part of the greatest generation that my friend and colleague Tom Brokaw wrote about. So my mom had just started college. She was born in Jersey City.
But wait, hold on. I'm fascinated if you don't mind talking about this.
Yeah.
So your father just disappeared one day.
Yeah, he just
was he a drinker?
He ended up ended up drinking himself to death at the age of 50. And my mom would say, he was good looking, great talent, but had this flaw. Alcoholism is just a terrible thing.
Did his ancestors come from, did you ever see, on my side,
I had no contact with the Ford side of the family afterwards, which was always puzzling to me.
Wow.
Not the grandparents, not anybody.
Wow.
And I always thought, and once I became a grandparent, and there's nothing, I was told, and it's absolutely true, that being the grandparent is your reward for having been the parent.
Okay, all right.
I love my children, couldn't be more proud of them. Both great athletes, daughter and son, both ended up playing lacrosse at Yale. My daughter is now a cancer surgeon. Son is a private banker with J.P. Morgan, very successful. And stuff. And I spent as much time as I could with them. But having their kids, and we just had 2 of them over for a couple of days, staying with us. So, I never understood that. How I said, look, people get divorced, that's fine, and people disappear from other people's life. You understand that, but I was always puzzled as to
I feel like we're doing your books. We're talking about the past and jumping to the future.
I know, that's okay.
Let's go back because that's fast. So
my mom
he
then
just disappears.
He basically disappears, leaving her. She had to file for bankruptcy because she had all these loans with her name. She didn't know anything about them.
Right.
So she had started college, and her first semester was 1941, and then at the end of her first semester, December 7th.
While she
And
has
so this is now, she's not married, so she's just a college student.
Got it.
But she does, when World War II breaks out, what so many people did. She left college and she worked in the rationing board in Jersey City, where she had
This
grown
is
up.
before she had the kids.
Before she got
Yeah.
war ends, marries my father, has the kids. He kind of disappears, and now she's on a street corner saying, all right, this is now 1958, 57, and she's saying, how am I going to raise these children? She goes back to college at the age of almost 40.
Wow.
And did 4 years of college in 2 years. She went to what was then Jersey City State Teachers College in Jersey City. It's now New Jersey City University.
Did she have people help raise the kids and stuff?
Her parents lived there. My grandfather was the superintendent of schools in Jersey City. So good position.
Yeah.
They had a nice house in Jersey City. They allowed us to, we lived with them for 2 years. And think about it, my grandparents were older.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden they have, at the time we were 8, 5, 3, and 1.
Right.
And now we are living with them. We're up on the third floor and a house. And, for grandparents and that generation, look, we're different now as grandparents than what our grandparents were. We're much more engaged and involved. I think we're in better shape physically. We live longer, all of those things.
Yeah.
But for my grandparents to say, all right, come, you're going to stay and you're going to live with us for 2 years and you're going to go, Peggy, you're going to go get your degree.
Right.
And she got her teaching degree. And then as soon as she did, she got her first job in Point Pleasant Borough. So we packed everything we had into this little black Chevrolet and we moved out of Jersey City and moved to the Jersey Shore. So I was 10. So we kind of grew up in the Jersey Shore, Point Pleasant Beach, where I graduated from, Point Pleasant Beach High School. And, it was a great place to grow up as a kid.
Yeah.
You grew up here, right? Great place to grow up as a kid. And we had great, the jobs were there. I worked as a lifeguard. I worked making pizzas on the boardwalk in Point Pleasant Beach, had jobs building swimming pools and driving beer truck and delivering. So I had all these, available jobs for us in high school and college. So, that's what got me to the Jersey Shore.
Yeah.
And, my mom became a teacher and was able to raise her 4 kids, not easily.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I got to Yale. My mother could never have paid for me, but fortunately, I got recruited to play football there and was on a full scholarship there. And I got into, fortunately, Yale's version of a Hall of Fame a few years back. And at the time I said, look, you guys, I showed up here with literally everything I owned in a single duffel bag.
Yeah.
I said, and I got here, I'm not so sure I would have gotten in here if they didn't want me to come play football. Who knows, might have, but it's worked out fine for all of us. Yeah. But what I said was I got here with everything I owned in a single bag. And I left Yale with everything I would need for the rest of my life.
Wow.
Because of the 4 years, that experience of learning and growing, and it wasn't so much the courses I took, but it was the people I met, and the experiences you had and how they taught you to think and speak and how they taught you to learn. So for me, I've often said that was the transformative time of my life, those 4 years that I was fortunate to be. Now, I was working all sorts of jobs while I was there, because they were paying for my room, board, and all the books and stuff. But you still had to exist. So I was bartending. I was working as a waiter. I was sweeping the gym floors. I was officiating intramural basketball games. All of these things to get through. But it was, I always point back. People say, "Do you have a hero?" I say, "Yeah, my mom was my hero. That she was able to pick up everything and say, all right, I got to figure out a way to make this work, and I will."
See. That's fascinating. I mean, for you to pick yourselves up on the bootstraps, to not feel sorry for yourselves.
And my mother never let us feel sorry for ourselves. And we didn't have. I tell the story that in 7th grade, I made the 7th and 8th grade basketball team. I didn't own a pair of basketball shoes. My sister and I shared a pair of tennis sneakers.
Yeah.
And what I did was I kind of hung around the high school gym, and somebody threw away a pair of sneakers, and nobody's looking. I took them home and taped them up, and that's what I wore. Of course, my children now laugh that as a consequence of that, you've got more shoes than you could ever possibly wear. And I said, yeah, well, that's what we do afterwards.
I was surfing in Puerto Rico probably three winters ago, and I'm sitting there in the lineup, and it was a pretty big day. It was maybe 10 to 15 foot waves. And I'm sitting there in the safe zone of the lineup, just waiting for the waves to come. And I look on the horizon and I would look like, oh my God, there was this enormous wave coming, and I was too far in to paddle out, and too far out to paddle in. And it's a 20-foot wave coming at me, and there's no lifeguards. And it's kind of like, you better get your shit together or you're going to die. Yeah. And so I just turned and I just said, don't panic. I pushed the board down. I ducked over the board as deep as I could and held on like my knuckles into the board
like
for
your
dear life.
Depended on it. Which
Yes,
it probably did.
yes, and the board turns around and I pop up, take a deep breath, and another 20-footer's coming at me. And there's no jet skis. There's no one saving you, and it's almost those sort of primal instincts. Like it's almost like a similar story to what you're saying.
You
like
do what you have to do.
Your mom was left on the corner, and she's like, no one was coming to help her. Right. And the same with you growing up. You're like, look, I can. So when you were doing criminal defense work, and people would say, oh, well, he grew up without a dad, or he had these challenges. So look, how did that shape you? You know, like when you have that excuse stuff going on.
Yeah,
like
it's interesting because I've often looked back at it, and
I mean, it's really, and I don't really want to talk politics too much, but it's almost like a liberal versus conservative view. Like the conservative, or at least the old conservatives, you know, they'd have no excuses. Right. They'd take responsibility. Right. It seems to have changed a bit in the last 8 years or so.
Everything's changed.
Everything's changed. Yeah. But how did that shape you, like in terms of that? And like, if you're representing someone that had a tough upbringing in a murder trial or something, and a lot of the excuse might be, look, he had a rough upbringing. Yeah. Could you sell that given you didn't have an easy upbringing and you turned out as you did?
It's funny you mentioned that, and that will get me in a moment. That exact situation about, you know, representing somebody in similar circumstance is actually what got me into television news. I'll get to that in a second. Yeah. But, you know, the way I looked at it a couple of different ways. First of all, for a while there, when you were a young kid, not having a father was kind of hard. Right. You know, because I would say, you know, I'd pedal to a Little League game and I didn't have anybody there, you know, and all the guys on my team.
I had no idea about this about you. I would have assumed that you grew up with a silver spoon in your mouth. Just how I've known you in the later years. That's fascinating.
Yeah, farthest thing from it. So but what I had was, again, I come back to my mother. Yeah, so I played 3 sports in high school. Yeah, you know, was recruited by a decent number of places. Ended up going to Yale, which back in the late '60s, early '70s was major football. But my mother, I always said, was the perfect sports mother. She went to everything she possibly could that I was doing. Yeah. And yet, all she cared about is, after the game, did you have fun? Right. You know, and I had some friends of mine whose fathers were brutal. Oh, yeah. You know, and I loved, the fathers were lovely guys, but when they got to their kids in sports, they were brutal on them. And I remember sometimes thinking, you know, this is my friend's father's yelling at him for what he did in practice. Yeah. And that's when you're supposed to make your mistakes. And I always thought, you know, maybe it's not such a bad idea that I don't have somebody, you know, on me. Yeah. You know, so it's interesting because with my own kids, who were both were great athletes, you know, I went to everything I possibly could. You know, I was doing a lot of traveling, covering stories, but whenever I could, I went, high school and college. And I stayed away from the crowds. I was all by myself. I didn't yell. I didn't say anything. I'd make sure I was in an eye line with them. So if they did something wrong, I'd say, I'd give them a gesture. It's okay. Calm down. It'll be fine. They did something right. I'll give them. That was great. You know, but I was never going to be one of those yellers because my mother wasn't, and she was sort of my model growing up. Yeah. So, you know, it parts of it were hard. You know, not having a father figure there. I was fortunate that I had my Pop Warner football coach, my high school coach, my college coach. All of these guys stepped in. I tell the story real quickly about not having a father. First day of Pop Warner practice. Right, I'm in 8th grade. When I started playing Pop Warner, the Golden Elks in Point Pleasant. And we had a really good team. We were actually undefeated and unscored upon through the regular season. Yeah. So the first day, the practice would be at night because the coaches were fathers and volunteers and stuff. And practice was over, and, you know, all the guys are getting in the cars with their dads right home, and I'm kind of walking home by myself, you know, from the practice field and the beach to where I lived in Point Pearl. And my coach, Percy Arnaud, just wonderful guy, but I was just meeting him now. And he comes up in his car and he pulls over and he says, Jack, he says, you know, can I give you a ride? And I said, no, Coach, I'm okay. Fine. He says, no, come on in. Let me give you a ride. He says, where do you live? And I described for him where I lived at the time in Point Pleasant Borough. And he says, I'm going right past there anyway. Come on. So I jump in the car. He takes me, and every day after practice, he'd bring me home. Later on, I find out it was nowhere near where he lived.
Oh,
nowhere near where he lived.
Yeah.
But he saw a kid by himself, didn't have a father around, and he said, I'll step in, I'm going to help these guys. Same thing in high school coaches. And these guys, they were at my weddings. They were all very, very helpful. But moving it forward, so, I would, if I saw people who, similar circumstances, of course, you'd be sympathetic to some extent.
Yeah.
And you try to tell their stories. So this is what gets me from practicing law into television. So I'm asked by a number of groups if I defend the first death penalty case. It's actually the first one in the Northeast, but it's taking place in New Jersey.
Let me ask you a question going back a little bit. Mm-hmm. So when you grew up without a dad and your mom's working, did you find, like, if you wanted something in life, you had to go get it? Yeah. Or if you had you needed something at school, you had to fill out the form. Right. You had to sign up for the team. Yep. Is that kind of what?
Yeah. I mean, you had to make things happen yourself. And my mom would help
where she could.
Where she could. But if not, you'd have to get out there and make things happen. And we all, my sister and I, we all chipped in. We did our jobs, and we put money in the jar, that we would help out. Because my mother, I remember, got paid 15th and the 30th of each month, and by the end of that month, we were having tuna fish sandwich and mayonnaise sandwiches.
Do you account a lot of your successes in life from those experiences growing up?
That's a good question.
Do you think if you had my son went to Villanova, my daughter's and you go on the little college Facebook page, and they're like, and I've said this before, but they say things like, the classes are closed down and I can't. So how does how do we sign up for the class? And the meal plan, they didn't have milk today. They had 2%. And so I called to find out if they could get the right milk, this whole helicopter parenting thing. Do you think if you grew up that way, where you had, do you think things might have been different?
It's a good question. And in looking back at this, and I've had long conversations with my mother when she was still alive. She passed away 6 years ago now, but she was 96, almost 97. And I had long conversations with her. And I came to believe that in many ways, growing up without the father, but having a great mother, who really pushed me when I should be pushed, and, was sympathetic when she should be sympathetic, and was, tough when she should be tough.
Yeah.
I think in many ways that kind of drove me, to try to be maybe more successful than other people might be. You were driven by what you didn't have.
Right, exactly.
Because you wanted it. Yeah. So I wanted to have a better life, obviously, to be able to do things and go places, and to be able to afford things that we couldn't do.
Did you find that raising you have two kids, right?
2 children. Yep.
Did you find that as a challenge, like the way you grew up versus the way your kids grew up?
That is a very good question.
And did you try to keep it real, so to speak, for the kids?
Good.
Like my kids, my kids are growing up I grew up similar to what you said. Thankfully, I had an awesome father and still have an awesome father, but I was the youngest of 13 kids, and they didn't make a lot of money. And I remember my mom pulling over at yard sales and different things to whatever we had to do. Yeah. The difference between when I grew up is there'd be one pair of sneakers for two people, but we didn't share them. Yeah. You had to get in a fist fight as to who was going to actually wear those sneakers. Right. And so for me, and that's when I look back at raising my kids, where I would get the most upset and yell the most is when they would complain about something that is 100% first world problem.
Exactly.
And I wouldn't say I grew up this way, but it was always a challenge because my kids grow up very differently than I do. So I'm always trying to instill the way I grew up in them. What was it like?
And the conflict is you want to do that, but you also want your children to have a better life than you did. Right? You don't want them to have to go through all the hardships that you did. So
but what's a better life though? Is a better life another pair of sneakers another thing, or is it?
For me, here's what
is it learning to overcome and be resilient?
My wife and I looked at this, and it was not only it was my upbringing was hard without a father's side. my wife grew up originally in Hoboken, moved to Spring Lake Heights. Lovely family. Her dad, Neil Kelly, third wave of D-Day. About 10 days in, lost half of his hand, came back home, worked for the state, was immensely involved in the community, Board of Education, the council, helping out the elderly at the time. Her mother, great parents, not a lot of money, state employees, had two brothers ahead of them. They put both brothers through law school, and she was kind of the baby. They sent her. She studied in Paris for a year, and she looks back now and she says, how did they ever afford to do that? Yeah. So they did what they could for their children. So we had decided, and we went through, when we got married when I started law school. My wife was teaching at Red Bank Catholic High School, making like $9,000 a year. I don't remember what Fordham cost at that time, but it was more than that. Yeah. We were both in the summer times. I was driving a beer truck, working as a bouncer at night. She was working as a lifeguard. We couldn't afford our own apartment. We house sat, and actually we live in Spring Lake now, about a block away from where we house sat for a year. Yeah. So that's what we were experiencing. We got lucky coming into my senior year, and I'll tell this story because it helped. It's a whole notion of transitioning into television. But I went on Jeopardy 3 times and won a bunch of money, so we were able to pay for the last year of law school. We were able to get our own apartment in Avon. But
how did you get on Jeopardy? Did you sign up for that?
Yeah. It was an interesting story. Jeopardy used to film and was in New York City,
right,
in 30 Rock. And I believe it's the studio that Jimmy Fallon's in right now.
Yeah.
So that's where they were located. And Jeopardy then used to be on at noontime. It was syndicated throughout this, and people were religious the way they are now. Their lunch breaks, if they were a worker, whatever you do, the bars would switch to Jeopardy at noontime. So it's my second year in law school. We're flat broke. I'm taking a train into New York City to Fordham, and one time I get on the train, I had to hand the guy a handful of coins, quarters and nickels and dimes, and the conductor looks at him, and he looks at me, and he says, "You know what, man? I think you need this more than the Jersey Central does. Here, keep it." And I said, and I had no pride. I said, "Thanks, I'll keep it."
Yeah.
So how can we make some money? And I had a friend of mine at Yale who was in the first group of Yale women. So my freshman year, Yale still was all male. My sophomore year, a group of transfer women came in. Junior year, it was the first group of a freshman cohort.
Wow.
Interesting, my daughter's Yale class, she graduated in 2004, was the first that actually had more men than women. More women, than men in it.
So your class was only men when it started?
Only men.
Wow.
And most of the Ivy schools were still all male back then. Cornell had always been co-ed, Penn had been co-ed.
Right.
But all of the Brown had co-ed element to it. But all the others, Princeton, Dartmouth, Harvard had Radcliffe, but they didn't have women in Harvard College.
Yeah.
So it was in that era they were all changing. So one of my good friends was in this first cohort of women, and she had gone on Jeopardy when she was at Yale. And sort of the attraction was one of the first Yale women, and she went on. I remember she won like $1,000 because Jeopardy back then was different from now.
Yeah.
Back then it was $10 through $50 or $20 through $100.
Right.
So you would win a game with like $800. Now you win with $12,000, $13,000. I mean, the numbers are much bigger.
Yeah.
So she goes on, she wins. And so my wife and I are figuring out, what can we do to make some money? And I thought, maybe I'll try out for Jeopardy. Wow. Because we used to play the game in our room sometimes. And I'd say, I'd kind of beat her when we were playing sometimes. So let's try that. So what you would do, the process then, now it's all online. Then you would write a letter, I'd like to try out.
Yeah.
And you'd get a note back saying, all right, we're going to have tryouts in the ballroom of the something hotel in New York City, on this date at this time. So I showed up, ballroom full of people. Everybody wants to get on Jeopardy.
Yeah.
So the testing process was they give you a pencil and pad and your name, and somebody up front would flip over cards, and you had like 10 seconds to write an answer.
Yeah.
And they do a whole series of them. And then they broke you up into smaller groups of like 5 or 6. And I came to find out later, I got to be friendly when I was on the show with one of the producers, and I was asking about it. And they said, we found a lot of people do great on the test.
Yeah.
But we put them in front of a camera, and they were terrible.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is a visual medium. This is an entertainment show. We can't have terrible people on.
Yeah.
So those are the two components of the test. And they said, thanks for coming. Don't call us, we'll call you and let you know.
Yeah.
If you don't hear from us, sorry. So a couple weeks later, I get a phone call for them, like on a Monday. And Jeopardy, they used to tape on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and they tape like maybe 6 shows in that time period. So they say, can you come on Thursday of this week? And I was right in the middle of exams at Fordham Law School. And I had 2 exams that day. And for a moment, I thought, can I blow off my exams to go? And my wife fortunately says, no, the whole point of this is to get you through law school. So I had to say to them, I can't come this week. I've got these law school exams. And they said, all right, we'll get back to you. And I thought, all right, I just blew my chance.
Oh, God.
Not going to happen. And fortunately, about 2 weeks later, they call and they say, how about this week? And it's like, yes, I will be there. So I go the first day, the Wednesday, and I don't get on the show. And they say to me, when we're leaving, you'll be on the first show tomorrow morning, And I'm looking, and I know there's a woman who had just won a whole bunch of shows in a row, so I'm going to be on with her. And back then, you could only win 5 shows.
Right.
And then you retired as a champion. Now you can keep going as long as you can. I didn't know who the third person was going to be. So I go home, and the interesting thing at the time, I said, back then you'd win a game with $800, maybe $1,000.
Yeah.
But they were in the midst of doing a promotional thing where if you ran a category, right? If you're a Jeopardy fan, that means you answer all the questions in one history. You answer all of them, 10, 20, 30, 40, $50. If you ran a category, you would get that money in your game, but there'd be a bonus pool that you would get, and that would just go into your pocket. It wasn't part of your game total. And each day that nobody did it, it went up $500. And by the time, so I'm watching the show, and the bonus pool is now around like $6,000 or $7,000. And I'm thinking, whoa, it was even more than that. I forget what it was. And I'm thinking, if I could do that, I'm paying for my last year of law school, So I went home, and I told my wife the story. And again, back then in Jeopardy, you could say history for $20, and I could hit my buzzer right away before I even saw what the question was, before it flipped.
Yeah.
Nowadays, if you watch Jeopardy, they can't buzz in until, now it's Ken Jennings, has read the question.
Right.
And you don't see this on television, but a light goes on. And that's when the contestants can buzz in. If they buzz in too soon, they're locked out.
Wow.
So much of it nowadays is your timing for your buzzer. Back then it wasn't.
Right.
I could say history for $20, bzz,
Yeah.
and then he's reading it. I'm thinking, oh, I hope I know what this is. But I decided to do that. I figured out like 7 or 8 different categories that I felt strong enough in that I was going to hit the buzzer beforehand, because I figured if I could win this pile of money, I'm good, whether I win the game or not. So I go in, I sit down, and I've got this woman who's won everything, me, and a woman who's driving us crazy in the green room, walking around saying, do you know who the third vice president's dog's name was? I do.
Oh, she's...
And I'm thinking, lady, I'm so nervous, I can't remember my own name.
Yeah.
Here we are, first time on television. And so,
it's like trash talking.
We get out there, and the curtain opens, and the lady who knew everything completely chokes. She just chokes right out.
Oh, God.
And I'm thinking, she's done. Now I just got to beat the one that keeps winning. So, Jerry, I sit down, and the board opens, and there's a sports category.
Okay.
Right? Now, you and I grew up as just sports junkies.
Yeah.
And we played every sport there was and read everything. And within the first minute and a half of the game, I had whatever it was, $7,000, $8,000 in my pocket.
Wow.
Just ran through the sports category.
Wow.
And it took all the pressure off. So they won a couple games, then lost, a third time on. But it allowed me to, we got home and paid for the last year of law school. We were able to go rent our own apartment.
Is this early 80s?
This was way back in the mid-70s.
Mid-70s, okay.
Mid-70s. Yeah. Art Fleming, if you're old enough, will remember, was the host, the kind of legendary host of Jeopardy. Don Pardo did the voiceover, and Don Pardo for years was the voiceover for Saturday Night Live. That deep, booming
Don
voice
Pardo.
Don Pardo, right?
Yeah.
So, again, it was a long time ago, and it aired just at noontime. But I'll tell one last story about this, because it ties into being a trial lawyer.
Yeah.
So the show is going to air. It's my beginning of my third year in law school, and we couldn't tell anybody what happened with it. It was sworn to secrecy. But remember, back then there were no VCRs or anything. If you didn't see it, you were never going to see it.
Right.
So I am working as an intern in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. A lot of high-profile cases, and I'm working for an AUSA, Assistant U.S. Attorney, who is trying this big political corruption case. So we're literally in the courtroom on the day that my first show is going to be aired.
Yeah.
And, I had told them about it, that the trial team was all excited. We got to get upstairs to our offices. We have some televisions up there. And so the clock is moving. It's 11:30. Now it's 11:40, 11:45, 11:50. Yeah. And there's kind of an important witness on the stand. And we're all looking at the clock. And finally, the guy who's the assistant U.S. attorney I'm working for, he says, all right, I got this. I'll take care of it. So he pops up out of his chair. Now, we got a courtroom full of people because, again, big political corruption. And he pops up and he says, Your Honor, could we approach the bench for a moment? Something very important I have to share with the court. So now everybody's buzzing in the back. So the defense attorney is like, what is this about? We get up to the thing. And he leans over and he says, Your Honor, but my intern, Mr. Ford, is on Jeopardy. And it's on today in about 10 minutes. And the judge says, he is. That's cool. He says, I've got a television in my chambers. I'll take care of this. So we all go back, and the judge very solemnly looks at the jury and says, Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to excuse you early for lunch today. Something has come up, and I need to have counsel back in my chambers to resolve this. So he goes, they leave, we go back, and everybody in the courtroom is saying, what, is this going to be a plea? What's going on?
God.
And basically we go in the back in the judge's chambers to watch Jeopardy the first time it's on. Because if I didn't see it, I would never have seen it.
Wow.
And it's funny because I did Celebrity Jeopardy some years ago, and they kind of knew I'd been on, and they did a search for it, but it didn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
They said in those days it was film, and after a while they would use it again for something.
Yeah, I looked for it.
Yeah, so
it's not on.
And I remember if I said to them, God, if I'd known that, I would have just said I won every day because there would be no proof that I had not. But there's nothing there, unfortunately. For the 3 times I was on when I was in law school.
So after you graduated law school, you went to the Monmouth County Prosecutor's
Prosecutor's Office.
So coming from Yale, having a Yale, and then Fordham, why'd you go back to Monmouth County? It sounded you probably could have gotten a job at a Feds or something.
I had Wall Street jobs, offered to firms, but I didn't want to do. I wanted to try cases, and I knew I had clerked for some big firms, and I knew if you're a young lawyer, you're not getting in the courtroom.
Yeah.
So I tried for some federal prosecutors positions, but they wanted you to have some experience beforehand.
Right.
And I talked to my the guy who became a mentor for me, who taught me trial advocacy at Fordham. Had been an assistant U.S. attorney.
Yeah.
And he was in private practice. And he said, Jack, you know where you get your best trial experience?
Is in a county, yeah.
County prosecutor's office or public defender's office.
Right.
That's when you're going to get to try the best. Now, he said prosecutors have a little bit more cachet.
Yeah.
In the public. Although I have said in the past, some of the best trial lawyers I ever saw in my life, public defenders.
Yeah.
But he said if he can do that. So I figured, all right, let's come back here. I grew up in Ocean County. My wife was in Monmouth County, so I put in the applications, and it turned out, a lot of it is, right place, right time, connections, people. So I didn't have a lot of, I didn't have a family. A father knew everybody and stuff. So I put the application in. I get a phone call back from the Monmouth County prosecutor and the Ocean County prosecutors. And I go first to the Monmouth County prosecutor, and I knew that the prosecutor's name was James Coleman.
Right.
And I knew he did some research, a long time, grew up in Asbury Park. He was an exceptional basketball player, played at Dartmouth.
Right.
And I'm thinking, James Coleman. So I get to the appointment, and I realize he went by Chip Coleman. So everybody knew Chip Coleman. And he had tried to recruit me to go to Dartmouth.
Oh, wow.
Just a phone call and stuff. And I mean, because I went up there and visited and stuff. And I get in front of him, the way you and I are, and he looks at me and he says, Jack, he says, do you remember, I was trying to recruit you to go to Dartmouth. He said, I know you went to Yale, and I saw some of your games there, and, but we beat you, that kind of thing. And our interview was all about a Yale-Dartmouth football game.
Yeah, oh, yeah,
And at the end, I say to him, well, Mr. Coleman, I really appreciate the time and stuff, and what would the next step be? And he says, you'll hear from us giving you a start date, and when you're going to do it. And it's like, so I've just been hired? He said, oh, yeah. You're coming in here.
Yeah.
And so, I got into the office at the same time that almost a big chunk of their top echelon of trial lawyers had left. Some got judgeships, some went into private practice. So I was there at a time, and this would never happen now.
Yeah.
It's a good-sized office, but I tried my first murder case when I had been a lawyer for less than a year.
Wow.
I tried my first major jury case when I had been a lawyer for about a month.
Right.
Because they just kind of dropped you in. And I said, for me, it was the best opportunity. I got great. In 5 years, I tried almost 50 cases.
Wow.
So it positioned me then to move on. But what it did is, the moving on, I was coming back to how I got into television.
Yeah.
And it also answered another question you asked about the idea of, my background and did I ever enter into what cases I took.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm now in private practice, firm in Red Bank. And, fortunately,
so you're 5 years in the prosecutor's office, roughly?
A little bit less than that, about 4 years.
That's a long time. I mean, that's,
went to a big firm, McCarter and English in New Jersey. Wonderful people, but I didn't feel comfortable in a big firm. So I left and had a good relationship. They would send me cases. Went to a firm, Phil Auerbach, Marty Rudnick, Danny Waldman.
How long were you at McCarter and English
Just
for?
for a year.
Oh, okay.
Just
Got
for a
it.
year. came back then in Red Bank, and it's like, this is what I want to do. Try cases.
Is it a pay cut? It must have been a pay cut.
It was a pay cut to start.
Yeah.
But what they said to me is, look, if this works well, first of all, you're doing what you want to be doing.
Yeah.
And you'll make it up quickly.
And the quality of life too, right? You're not commuting.
We were living at the time in Interlaken.
Yeah.
Eventually moved 35 years ago, moved to Spring Lake.
Yeah.
Right as I was leaving practicing law and television. But at the time, we were living in Interlaken. Instead of driving to Newark every day, I'm in Red Bank. I'm doing what I want to do. I'm just trying cases all over the place.
Yeah.
Got some that got a lot of publicity, which is always good for you, right? You and I have the same walls when we walk into the office of our pictures and your great verdicts that you've gotten in settlements and things, and it's important.
Yeah.
And so I'm asked by a number of groups. It's the U.S. Supreme Court threw out the death penalty in 1972.
Yeah.
They didn't say we couldn't have it. It wasn't cruel and unusual punishment. They say it was arbitrarily enforced.
Right.
So they set up some rules. If you're going to have a death penalty, you have to have aggravating factors. It's not just a jury or judge saying, yeah, we're going to give you the death penalty, but no, we're not going to give you that. So I'm asked by these groups, and I meet with, and it's a young man from Long Branch, and I meet with him and his mother, and his mother reminded me of my mother. She was raising her children all by herself. Her son, she had a black family in Long Branch. She was a nurse. She did extra shifts. It just reminded me of my mother. He was a kid who never been in trouble before in his life, and unfortunately, he ends up in a drug deal that goes bad, and basically pulls the trigger and ends up killing another kid. And it's a white kid, so I know that race is going to be an issue.
Yeah.
But the mother said, I don't have any money. And I said, you know what, that's okay. Fortunately, I can afford to do this sometimes. And, I look at you and I see my mother, trying to raise a family and doing all the right things, and he makes a mistake, a horrible mistake. You can't make a bigger mistake than he did. And he'd confessed to it. Yeah. So before, he got a lawyer. So the question was going to be, is he going to get the death penalty or not? But that's a situation where, again, I looked at her, and it was my mother. Yeah. Struggling to raise a family and do the right thing, and I said, that's okay. We can, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You pay me. So tried the case, got a lot of publicity. Cameras in our courtroom. Because it was for a death penalty case. New York Times there every day, did profiles on me and the prosecutor.
Now, why is it a death penalty case? Just because it's the potential can be the punishment? Yeah. And this is in New Jersey.
So it's in New Jersey, and and it's interesting because prosecutors...
Like, does the prosecutor say, we're going to go for the death penalty?
There has to be what they call an aggravating factor.
Right.
It's not enough simply for one person to take somebody else's life.
Right.
So what was the aggravating factor? And the aggravating factors can be things... It was done for money. Yeah. It was especially cruel and heinous. Yeah, yeah. You were trying to get rid of a witness in a case. Yeah. This case, Jerry, would not be a death penalty case today. Right. Horrible murder, terrible. Took the life of somebody. Right. A drug deal went bad. Right. But it didn't really have kind of those aggravating factors. We always when I would travel in the country and teach people about defending death penalty cases, it's and prosecutors would agree with me. It has to be murder plus. Yeah. Something else. Yeah. But back then, prosecutors said, we got a death penalty. I got a guy who killed somebody. I guess let's make it a death penalty. Yeah. So, again, a lot of attention, media attention. When it was over, I did a bunch of interviews, and one of them was with Channel 2 in New York City, CBS affiliate. And it was a live interview we did on their 5 o'clock news. And when it was over, the news director came out and he said, you seem comfortable on TV. Have you done this before? And I said, look, my football coach up at Yale had a weekly New England show, and that's when we were kind of national powers. Yeah. My junior year, we were ranked like 16th in the nation. This was before it was 1A and 1AA. We were ranked ahead that year of some of the major teams. And I said, and I put myself through my last year of law school on Jeopardy, and again, the reaction was, you were at Jeopardy? Yeah. Which is astonishing because it's still the reaction today that I get from people. So he said, how'd you like to come on once a week with us here if there's an interesting trial going on or a Supreme Court decision. So I started doing that.
And is that paid or it's just guest?
Yeah, they were paying me maybe $500 an appearance or something. Yeah. But for me, it was great, this publicity. You and I talked about the fact that, if people will see you doing this, and people will know you, and it gets you out there. And the fact that I was on television, you know,
You're way more likable than I am, though. No one's called me out to put me on anything.
So anyway, we're
Oscar's
doing
laughing.
this. So doing this for about 5 or 6 years, and still picking and choosing cases to try.
And I was never voted the most sexy news person in the world either. Wasn't that
I
1999?
I thought that was not going to come up at all.
Well, you brought it up.
Not the People magazine. People magazine, 1999. They used to have this, sexiest man, and then they had all these other categories. And I got a call,
honey, I was just voted the most sexy person.
I get a call from People magazine. They had done a nice profile on me back when I was covering the O.J. Simpson trial.
Yeah,
it was very nice. And
what trial was that? Never heard of that one.
Never heard of that one. And so I called me back up.
It's hot in here.
Call me back up, and the guy says, "Hey, it's so and so. You remember I did this profile on you a couple?" I said, "Absolutely, it was great." He says, "Well, we want to do something else." And I had just moved from NBC News to ABC News. So I was going to that season. Connie Chung and I were anchoring an edition of 2020. They had a couple U Downs. Barbara Walters did one night. Connie Chung and I did another night. And that's what I thought they were going to do, the move. I said, "Oh, yeah." He says, "Well, it's not what you think it is."
Yeah.
I said, what is it? And he says, "Well, our sexiest kind of." I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, we have a category about news anchor." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, it's you this year." It's like, I said, "Who is this really?"
Yeah.
And I went home, and it's interesting. I remember telling my family, and my daughter was probably 13 at the time, and she looks at me and says, "Oh, Dad, please don't do this to me." So anyway, it's a sort of funny thing. But in the 5 or 6 years, I'm still going up Channel 2 and I started kind of being asked to do some other TV. So I was doing some things on PBS where they'd have these roundtable seminars about issues and societal issues, and they're very well regarded and won a lot of awards. And then after about 5 or 6 years, within that time period, Court TV started.
Right.
Court TV, people don't remember, cable television show, and the network's purpose was we're going to televise trials live.
Yeah.
Some of them were on tape, but most of them were live. And there was always a question: is this going to go? But it was, the partnership was HBO and NBC. Some people, big media people, put money into this thing. So I was asked if I would be one of the first 3 anchors. But now I'm still trying some cases, but they worked out a deal with me. So they said I was anchoring like the 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock slot. So if I was in court, and if I was really stuck traveling someplace to try a case, they say, "Okay, take the week off." And do
right.
That. So doing that, still practicing a little bit of law.
And you're still at the Auerbach firm?
Yeah. But with what I did is at the time, it shifted a little bit, and Phil split off, and it became Rudnick, Waldman, and Ford.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately Rudnick, Waldman, Ford, Adonisio, and Papa. Jim Adonisio and Mike Papa joined us. And as I was doing more television now, because I was getting paid for these things, what I did is I became my own firm within the firm.
Got it.
Right, so I was still up there.
Did you have to, were any of the partners be like, "Hey, we get a piece of that," or anything?
Well, what we did was, and they were good friends of mine, and still good friends of mine. Sadly, a couple of them have passed away. Phil Auerbach passed away. Marty Rudnick passed away. Danny Waldman became a judge and has since retired. Jimmy Adonisio is retired. Mike Papa's still working. But what we did is I said, "Guys, whatever comes in, I'm not going to handle. I'll just give it to you guys.
Yeah,
you keep. I'll keep what I'm going to keep." And it worked out fine. And they were good friends.
Yeah,
and they figured it was good for their business also. So doing that, and then still doing some Court TV stuff. And then a couple of years later, I had started sort of guest appearances on the Today Show. And they'd introduced me as Jack Ford, practicing trial lawyer, also an anchor on Court TV.
Yeah.
And I was doing that for a while. And then NBC came and said, "Okay, come with us full time."